hosted by the Kautilya School of Public Policy. I'm Smita Sharma. I'm an independent journalist and a visiting faculty. And each month we try and pick up one topical issue, one issue where there is a lot of, in fact, debate, discussion that is ongoing, and try and look at this issue with our panel of experts beyond what is being reported in the news, really a deep dive conversation to say so. And today, of course, the topic that we are going to discuss is about the G20 presidency that India has assumed. It assumed it from 1st of December last year. We, in fact, got this responsibility from Indonesia. And India will be convening the G20 summit meeting of the top leaders in September this year. Now, this is the first time that this summit meeting is to be hosted in India, but it's important to put it out there that G20, in fact, summit meetings are hosted by way of rotation among members itself. So this is India's turn this year, which is why India is hosting the summit meeting. And, you know, it's happening at a time when you see that a third of the world's economies are really sort of bracing up for an economic recession. The Ukraine war continues. There are no signs of that ending, even as we are emerging from the shadows of a pandemic. India, of course, is also hosting, in addition to G20 summit, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit meeting this year. So we thought for the first Let's Talk Policy in this first month of the new year, and a happy new year to all those who have joined in, the attendees in this webinar, all those who will be watching the live stream on the social media platforms. But, you know, really to try and take us through of what we see in terms of the challenges for India's G20 presidency and also the foreign policy issues itself. I have a very well-informed panel with me, Ambassador Dr. Mohan Kumar. He's currently the Dean and the Office of International Affairs and Professor at O.P. Jindal Global University. He has served as the former chairman RIS. He's been a former, in fact, diplomat who has been India's ambassador to France. I also have with me Ambassador Rahul Chabra. He's a retired career diplomat, has served as the former Secretary Economic Relations at the Ministry of External Affairs, also as the former Joint Secretary Central Europe in the headquarters. He's been the former High Commissioner to Kenya, to former Ambassador to Somalia, Hungary, among others. And I have with me Suhasini Heather, an award-winning journalist, one of the most prolific writers on foreign policy, also, you know, somebody who's the diplomatic affairs editor of The Hindu. So happy to have all of you. And as I begin this conversation, what I'm going to do is, you know, let me start by asking each of you, before we talk about India's G20 responsibility, to slightly gaze into where do you see the Ukraine war heading. We are seeing the continuous inflow of tanks, of more, in fact, aircrafts going in, be it through NATO or countries like Poland asking Germany for permission to send in some more, in fact, tanks as well. Where do you think, Ambassador Chabra, is this war heading? Is there anybody who's winning this war?
Good evening, Smita. Thank you for having me on your show. Yeah, looking ahead, I think we can see some sort of a stalemate being reached, and there is a sense of a little bit of fatigue seeping in. So we need to keep that in mind. And in that sense, this is the moment to sort of look for actually a face-saving formula, keeping in view that President Putin, his background, and that really he's not really answerable to that extent, like any democratic leader to his people. So it may not be such a good idea to push him to a corner where, you know, he may do things that may sort of completely turn things upside down. On the other hand, the West, I think it's quite clear that the only people really benefiting from it and benefiting in a large way is the arms lobby. And having served in Washington, D.C. for over 3 years on the Congress and seen how these lobbies work, they are really, they have big skin in the game. So they are the ones who are probably pushing and getting these sort of policies out. So it's time for countries like India to sort of step in. Of course, we should keep in mind that we are not the only one who can step in, and we can't do it alone, of course, also. So we need to sort of try and douse the fire rather than exacerbate the conflict. So this is really time for deft diplomacy. The time has come. So I think keeping in view all this, this is the moment to sort of strike with diplomatic initiatives.
Okay, and I'm going to come to, in fact, that discussion in a short while from now, particularly in terms of India's role as an interlocutor. But Ambassador Mohan Kumar, if I could come and ask you the same question, what's really happening with the Ukraine war? Do you see any signs of any party really sort of wanting to take a back step at the moment, or Russia losing the war, or Ukraine being in a position where it can hit back harder? Do you see more arms ammunition actually going to keep flowing into the region in the next few months?
Thank you so much for having me, Smita. No, my take is that the Ramstein Defense Contact Group, which met on January 20th among 50 countries, which actually decide on what arms to give to Ukraine. My assessment is that a fundamental paradigm shift has happened in the West approach to Ukraine. I believe, it's my impression and my interpretation, of course, I feel they have come to the conclusion that Russia can be dragged to the negotiating table only if they are defeated in the battlefield, number one. Number two, they want Ukraine to eject Russia from areas occupied by it in Ukraine. Now, it is one thing to say Russian occupation of some areas of Donbass and you can fight it out and so on. But if that includes also blocking Russia's land corridor access to Crimea, which I keep hearing now and then, because Ukraine's objective seems to me to go back to the borders as they existed before Russia's annexation of Crimea, then I think we are in for trouble. I thought I saw Ramstein meeting as a ratcheting up of pressure on Russia. And the kind of weapons that are now already being delivered a little bit and now sought to be delivered actually enables Ukraine to now take the war to Russian territory. Henceforth, the West has been careful in supplying weapons to Ukraine, which they can fight out within Ukraine. But I think the kind of tanks, for example, the Leopard 2 tanks have a range of at least 300 miles. And that is a lot because that is exactly the distance between Kiev and Moscow, if you like, or at least the border of Russia. So I think I would submit to you that things will get a lot worse before they get better. One last point on the way on implications for India's G20 presidency, since that is what we are talking about. I thought the paragraph on Ukraine in the Bali leaders' declaration was a masterstroke. And I'm told India also contributed to it. They made it seem factual and they repeated the UN General Assembly resolution language by saying that they want an unconditional withdrawal from Russia, from Ukraine. I don't know how Russia agreed to that paragraph, by the way, because you take the debt paragraph of 33 and they say one country dissociated itself from it, which is China. So Russia could have very easily said, listen, we dissociate ourselves from this paragraph, but they did not. And the formulation used is many countries condemned the Russian aggression, others had a different view, and so on. I thought this was brilliant. I'm talking from a very selfish point of view. We can just repeat this formulation in September. This is what I'm thinking. Okay. Otherwise, this paragraph would have been such a headache for India. So, but go back to your original question. I think things will get very, very ugly and bad before they can become better. But that's my brief assessment.
That does seem to be, in fact, the common thread here. So, Hasini, Ambassador Mohan Kumar says that why not repeat that formulation? Of course, there's many a slip between the cup and the lip going from now into September. But really from India's perspective, and from your own perspective, where do we see this war headed beyond what is being said in public? Of course, we've had a lot of discussions around the Prime Minister's formulation of this is not the era of war, what he told Putin in SCO, in the public eye. But beyond all of that, really, what is our reading of the situation currently?
Well, I think if you're looking at the military situation in the Ukraine, we are in the middle of the winter, both in Russia and Ukraine. So while we aren't seeing a pause in the attacks, if you like, on civilian territories as much as one would have hoped, there is certainly less of the offensive that we have seen. The last big wars the battles are being fought out in two different parts of Ukrainian territory right now. As far as Russian military strategy goes, remember a few months ago, Mr. President Putin announcing the draft for Russian soldiers. They will be trained and supposed to be ready, and Russian armaments are supposed to be ready for a spring offensive. So the question is, how much is going to happen once the spring does come about in the Ukraine will depend on how good or how not so prepared Russia is going to be. As Ambassador Mohan Kumar put quite rightly, the real question is not about whether Russia is going to in some way come for talks immediately, but the question is, where is that line going to be? At present, Russia has taken over so many parts of Ukraine. Many have said it's between 15 to 20% of Ukrainian territory now is with Russia. So if you've got that entire corridor to Crimea under Russian control, at least everything on this side of the Dnipro River, it would have to be a really stark scenario in which we would actually see Russia backing off from Ukrainian territory. So by all accounts, and I'm not near the ground there, but from what I understand from experts, the expectation is of some kind of status quo through this year. Perhaps Russia will not make further gains, especially given the new influx of tanks and all the rest that is expected, but perhaps it will not be possible for President Zelensky's forces to push Russia out of the territory they have taken right away. What does this mean for India? To begin with, Prime Minister Modi will have to keep that balancing act going. If he's saying this is not the era for war, he's also not taking part in the Western sanctions. In fact, India is now, for all practical purposes, a part of the Russian economy when you consider how much we have increased in terms of our intake of Russian oil. We've gone from about 40,000 barrels per day to 1 million barrels per day as of December. Russia is now India's highest oil exporter. And we know that this is not actually going into petrol pumps in India for large part. A lot of it is just going in for re-export through the refineries in India, one of which is 50% owned by Rosneft, the Russian company.
And a lot of it is actually being snapped up by the US itself.
Absolutely, absolutely. This kind of now Indian branding on it. So on both sides, I think the Indian government has no real pressure to change its position. But Prime Minister Modi will have to do much more of it. Remember, as G20 G20 host last year, President Joko Widodo had to travel to both Kiev and Moscow. The question is, will Prime Minister Modi do the same? He does owe Moscow a visit in that sense. He did not go to Moscow last year for the annual summit. So some talk about a possible visit this year, which could be clubbed with a visit to the region, even possibly Ukraine. And I think the third thing where we have to watch out for India is going to be the visit of President Putin to India. Remember, he's not just invited in September for the G20, but possibly in June for the SCO summit. Maybe he will not come for both, but if he at least comes for one of them, for example, the SCO summit, then perhaps it will be a little easier diplomatically for India when it comes to September.
Right. In fact, there are a lot of questions that will also come up with the SCO summit. Also, in fact, whether President Xi Jinping himself will come in for both the summit meetings or not. But Ambassador Chhabra, going back to the question of oil, we've seen the record number of oil imports. January was the highest ever, and for the past few months, in fact, the record levels have actually been broken. A lot of it are being sort of re-exported to US, which is being refined here in India. With the war continuing, as India moves into the presidency, what do you see as the real impact, the areas of bigger impact, especially on the global south because of this war?
We've talked about the 3 Fs, the fuel, the fertilizer, and the food. So, I think these are the 3 critical impacts on the global south. and it's hurting quite badly. And it's not only the global south now. The inflation figures in many of the Western countries have also sort of reached record levels, not seen since World War II. So this impact is rapidly spreading across the global economy. And as you yourself mentioned, two-thirds of the world is probably facing a recessionary scenario. So there's a huge impact of this. We may continue and hopefully grow at between 5 to 6%, stave off the recession. But then if the rest of the world is sort of going into that situation, there will be an impact on India also.
Okay, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, we have also seen India recently host that Global South Summit meeting. At the moment here, how do you really see we've already seen a lot of impact on the global supply chains, which are the bigger areas of worry in the shadow of this war at the moment?
So I think two areas where India will have to look out for in this G20. One is known as the Debt Service Suspension Initiative taken by the G20. They had this program of really suspending all debt service, and they are now trying to evolve a common framework for debt treatment. This was the famous paragraph, Smita, I was talking about, from which China dissociated itself in the Bali Leaders Declaration. I personally feel strongly that India must bring this common framework for debt treatment to fruition. And one way of doing it would be that, the details of what the leaders said in the Voice of Global South Summit is not yet out. I can only second guess what many of the countries would have said, given the profile of these least developed countries from Africa. They would want pure and simple just for the debt to be cancelled, frankly, in view of the tough whammy that they have received. First, the pandemic, and then you've got what is known as the war in Ukraine, which, as Ambassador Chabda said, the 3 Fs and so on. So this will be a crucial indication of whether India is successful in bringing this common framework for debt treatment, which has been discussed in the last 2 summits at least, but which the Bali Declaration says we will try and implement it, we will make progress. I think that is gone now. India will simply have to get these countries to agree on a common framework. That's number one. Number two, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda to support the SDG goals of 2030. Everybody now knows that the 2030 date for achieving goals like no hunger, no abject poverty, gender, education, health, all of this is unrealistic, frankly. Even for a country like India, I would submit that, frankly. It's going to be increasingly difficult for us to achieve these goals. So what do? We need more finance. And again, the G20 has been talking about the Addis Ababa Action Agenda to provide finance. There is also a PPR, which is Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness and Response, which again, the fund has been created in World Bank. So I would say these 3 funds India sought out. We want concrete action now in these 3 funds. The one with the World Bank, the one which is Common Framework for Debt Treatment, and the third, Addis Ababa Action Agenda to support the SDG goals. This needs to be done. I think the second thing that India will have to do is really try and see whether we can do something about climate finance, the $100 billion, the famous $100 billion, which was promised by the developed countries in Paris and which has not been met. And we agreed, Smita, if you remember, in Sharm el-Sheikh for a loss and damage fund, which again, no action has been taken since then. India is not likely to get any money from the loss and damage fund of the climate change, but I think we owe it to our brethren in the global south for progress to be made. I will conclude by making one perhaps novel suggestion, at least from my point of view. Why doesn't India come up with a balance sheet of past declaration, at least the previous 2, and see how progress has been made?
Kind of an audit, a kind of a white paper or an audit on the goals delivered.
Because people, first of all, the G20 declarations tend to be wordy and long.
Yes.
People read it, people like you and me read it, maybe the next day the summit happens and then we forget about it. I think the time has come for India to make this balance sheet. It's not a bad idea. And it's fine if we accept that $100 billion has not been given. What's the problem in accepting that you're not made progress instead of repeating the same thing? I would strongly argue for the G20's own credibility, and India's presidency gives India the perfect opportunity to do it. Audit, as you rightly said, is the right word. And at least a few areas we say that this is the progress that has been made. It's incremental, but we would like to see more progress. I think that has come for G20 to do that, frankly.
I think it's a good suggestion. And before I bring in Suhasini on this, I want to go back to Ambassador Chabra on this idea itself, and also the fact that, when we talk about a lot of heavy jargons in this declaration, for instance, now at the Voice of Global South Summit, the External Affairs Minister said that India's G20 presidency agenda will prioritize globalization paradigm focused on vulnerable populations. Sounds very nice. What are the tangibles, that can be seen as real outcomes which stand true to these words that are spoken or words that are there in print?
The tangible outcomes could be in 3 or 4 broad areas, like health, the CoWIN platform. That's one of the ones that can be given out to the global south. Then there is in terms of financial inclusion. So again, the sort of direct benefit transfer to the population. So this is another area where the global south could benefit. Education. So these are the sort of tangible areas where India has reached for sort of what we call the digital stack, which is available of this sort of AI-driven models, which are completely IT-driven, which can be now scaled up and are ready to be replicated in countries with a similar level of technology adoption. It is not a very high-tech sort of solution, but it provides a solution to these people where they can clearly and quickly and directly benefit from these.
Right. Suhasini, now which takes me to the next part of my conversation and links it to the first part really on the Ukraine war, because again, the foreign minister, the entire foreign ministry itself have been engaging with people across the nation on G20 issue. And 2 things that Dr. Jaishankar has said is, one is that even having everybody in the room was a real challenge in the last G20 meeting in Bali. And the other thing that he said was that India is well placed to manage contradictions and divergent agendas because of its independent foreign policy and ability to find a common ground with different players. But at the same time, you also see India's reticence or hesitation whenever it comes to being on the record and saying that I'm playing the role of an interlocutor. So really, how do you see India being able to bridge this divide between, be it Russia, Ukraine, or even bringing China on the table to bridge the differences?
Well, I think to begin with, the world has been dealing with so many different, in fact, the new catchword geopolitically is polycrisis. So the world has been dealing with, even before the Ukraine war, was dealing with the COVID-19 impact, was dealing with a year-on-year economic recession, which is really showing up around the world now. It's dealing with a climate change crisis. Look at any region of the world, it's being affected more and more by climate change. And then you had it also dealing now with the problems of the Ukraine conflict, which is not just in terms, as Ambassador Chabra said, of food, fuel, and fertilizer shortages, but in terms of the global polarization. The fact that the West has now sanctioned Russia does not just mean that this is between Russia and the West. Slowly, what we are seeing is a decoupling of the Russian economy from the Western economy. Over time, this is also going to have an impact. We've seen it in a small way, where that Indian submarine that was completed in Russia could not be brought to India because Russian crew was not allowed to go through Western channels. So we're seeing it in many daily events where it has become much more difficult to pay for things that we want from Russia. It has become much more difficult to work in a dollar economy. So what is the world going to do? Are we going to de-dollarize? Are we going to look at 2 different economies of how the world goes? So that's another part of the crisis. And one part, as you pointed out, of this poly-headed crisis is what China is going to do next, because China's aggression in the South China Sea. It's last year, the aggression towards Taiwan. Its actions at the line of actual control. We're going to head into 3 years now of the standoff at the line of actual control with India. All of this is going to feed into the tasks that Prime Minister Modi has when it comes to the G20 to bring them together. You spoke about mediation. The truth is we are not at that point right now where mediation of any kind seems to be working. If you remember when Prime Minister Modi suggested that he could carry, some of the, try and bring together the positions of the two, at that point, President Zelensky said, I have nothing to say. I will not speak to Mr. Putin. Similarly, although we have heard External Affairs Minister Jaishankar say that when it was necessary to pass on a message, and Ukraine asked us to, we did pass on those messages. I think that's at the limit of where we're going to see mediation. Remember, India is not the only country that is in a position to speak to both countries. My sense is that there will be efforts made by all of those countries. So you have countries like Turkey, you have countries like Indonesia already trying, you have other countries as well that are not necessarily in one camp or the other, trying at least to ensure that there is some communication channel between the two. And finally, I think even the United Nations, which otherwise has performed very poorly, was at least able to get together some mediation when it came to allowing those shipments of food to come through from the Black Sea. So that's where mediation is at this point, Smita, and I completely agree with Ambassador Mohan Kumar when he says until one side looks like it is definitely losing the war, it is very difficult to see in what scenario both sides will be ready to come to the table. In other words, if this remains a status quo, like a stable status quo for a while, then it remains to be seen what the world is going to do. Because remember, a stable status quo is effectively a victory for Russia, which has taken all the areas that it had laid claim to. But it's by no means certain that that's where the West will allow it to remain. It is right now not in either side's interest to do that mediation, because neither side has said they want to end the war. It is only countries like India that are saying this is not the era for war, please end this conflict.
The ones who are in direct conflict, of course, nobody wants to be backing off at this point in time. But now my chat box is flooded with questions, and I definitely see a very high amount of interest in this particular edition of Let's Talk Policy. I will come to those who have raised hands, and when I call out your names, we'll try and take 2 questions. You can speak out your questions, tell us which, in fact, panelist it is for specifically, and please keep them short so that we can take in more questions. But before that, in fact, former Ambassador Sri Kumar Menon, who had served in Angola and South Sudan, he has a question. Maybe Ambassador Chabra, you can take it. He asks, given the need for India to adopt a tough balancing stance, in particular on Ukraine, Russia, and China, how do you see India leveraging its forthcoming presidency of the SCO to play a more proactive and constructive role in reaching out to Western powers like the US and the EU? And Suhasini, there's something problematic with the camera angle. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so the SCO is coming up, as you mentioned, even before the G20. So, of course, it has Russia, China, and the Central Asian republics as members, Pakistan. So it is another forum. If we are able to get, again, the Indian side is able to get a sense and a feeling of how things are moving forward, that's when you take it forward to the G20, to the other leaders, the Western world, which is not members of the SCO. So I think in that way, India is, since being present, will get a good sense of what's brewing in SCO, what is the feeling there, and then being able to take it forward to the rest of the world via the G20 and other forums.
Okay, I'll take one more question for you, Ambassador Chabra. Dr. Minarul, by the way, Ambassador Mohan Kumar says that the idea of having the balance sheet is really great and asks to what extent can India really deliver in its attempt to utilize its G20 presidency for strengthening the South-South cooperation. Ambassador Chabra, if you would like to take that.
Yes, I think it has it can deliver very successfully if it focuses on the areas that we have mentioned, that we are focusing on. The green development, climate finance issues, the lifestyle for environment. We've already sort of proposed a sort of a way forward in that sense. accelerated and inclusive, resilient growth. Again, we are going to be one of the countries growing at that rate. The SDGs, as Ambassador Mohan Kumar mentioned, maybe not realistic to achieve them by 2030, but at least we can change the narrative to, rather than being a recovery decade, as they're calling it, an action decade still. This faster we get going on that front. Similarly, digital public infrastructure, we already spoke about the different areas where we have strengths, which we put forward. Multilateral institutions for 21st century, we're trying to reform that. We are talking about that. It may not happen at the UN Security Council, voting at the Bretton Woods organization, but at least it's reaching a level of certain sort of, there is resonance in what we say. Earlier, it was just sort of brushed aside. That plus this focus on women-led development. So I think the areas that we have decided to focus on, they've been chosen. And if we focus on that, I think we can move forward and show success in that.
Okay, I'll take a question that Vivek Datta has put in the chat box and then go to our attendees. Vivek Datta asks, and Ambassador Mohan Kumar, if you would like to come in on this, that will the presidency of G20 summit help India to attract investments for manufacturing segment or reach the dream of achieving the 5 trillion economy? Of course, with 56 locations, we are looking at G20 as a big cultural tourism event too, but really in terms of the manufacturing segments getting a push, Ambassador Kumar?
The honest answer to that question has to be no. Because I think companies like Apple or, Foxconn, when they make huge investments, and mind you, India needs huge investments to make that 25% share of manufacturing to GDP. It's not possible through tourism, for example. I think the one sector which can get impetus is tourism. I readily concede that the present situation with regard to tourism is not satisfactory, in the sense everybody knows that Thailand, which is a much smaller country, gets so many more tourists than India. So tourism is a sector which might get a push thanks to G20, but not massive Make in India projects which are necessary so that India can reach that 25% figure.
Okay, let me in fact now go over to our attendees who have kept their hands raised for a long time. Manoj, I saw your hand raised. If you have the question, you could please go ahead and tell us who do you have the question for? Can we have Manoj and then Ekam Singh and Shashwat Sinha? Yes, Ekam Singh, please go ahead, unmute yourself and ask us.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, ma'am. Good evening, ma'am and sirs.
Yes, go ahead. Please ask your question and keep it short.
Sir, I would like to ask the question. Sir, recently India hosted Global South Summit. And sir, it shows that India is still following the NAM-like path which it followed since independence to balance the both powers like Russia-China bloc as well as US and Western bloc. So sir, in this 21st century, is this relevant?
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Non-alignment, we are calling it strategic autonomy. Let me get a question from Shashwat Sinha there. Shashwat, unmute and ask your question, please. Shashwat, please ask your question.
Good afternoon, ma'am and sir. Ma'am, I would like to have a question that we have seen how Western countries have weaponized the SWIFT payment system by first kicking out Iran and then Russia. So how India's UPI can be an alternative to the SWIFT payment system, looking at its losing success in India?
Okay, thanks, Shashwat. Who would like to take in this question from Shashwat? So Hasini, would you like to take this?
I think Ambassador Mohan Kumar is the right person to take it. But yes, the Indian rupee is making inroads in at least the neighboring countries. The question really is, as I said, the question is when we look at the international economic system, every multilateral organization has come under strain over the last few years, whether it is the UN Security Council that has not been able to find a way to stop this war. That's supposed to be its first role. And the reason the United Nations even came together was to ensure that nothing like the world wars come back to hurt the world again. Whether it's a WHO and its terrible performance over COVID, or whether it is now the WTO. All of these international multilateral organizations of the previous century are now under strain. And I think when we are looking at each of these things, and obviously, India is making inroads in its own way, so is China, so are other countries around the world. You have to look at where is the international system going. We can't at one side be saying rule of law, international rule of law, we want to work with the multilateral system around the world at a time when nobody in the world is listening. The US's sanctions, EU sanctions are actually a travesty of previous commitments on the multilateral stage. What Russia has done in Ukraine, the unilateral bombing of Ukrainian cities, the killing of civilians, the accessing and the annexing, as well as the referendums that they have carried out in these areas, are all a travesty of international rule of law. So when you're looking in that system, and I know it's a very large scale answer to your specific question about UPI, I think we have to really wonder what is next in a sense for world order, and then work it down from there. Until then, what you will see is unfortunately a lot of bilateral tactical measures. I am not sure that G20, by the time the G20 happens, will be able to actually bring some kind of global sanity, restore that, and bring everyone back on the table together. But until then, certainly there will be all of these initiatives, and India is taking them out very persistently on a bilateral basis with many countries. I think those will remain successful.
Ambassador Kumar, your thoughts on this question of the entire fight, and also if you could add, because we also see that India does want to use its presidency to champion the homegrown digital services, some of which are already being used by countries. So, if you could add a little bit on that as well.
So hard to disagree with what Ms. Suhasini Haidar had said. So I would associate myself with her remarks. Secondly, I believe you need to make a distinction between the platform, which is the UPI, and then the de-dollarization or removing the dependence on the dollar. Those two are different things. That is my understanding. I don't think India is trying to do that through the UPI.
So India is not trying to place UPI as an alternate to SWIFT?
Yes, not at all. We are just trying to see if there can be an open source model which can provide a platform for payments. And I think we've been extremely successful. Smita, if you allow me, there was an interesting question on non-alignment, going back to non-alignment. Yes. Would you allow me to answer that, please?
Yes, please, go ahead, please.
So I want to compliment the student for asking that question. I think it's an important one. I have an interesting answer, which is why I was kind of keen to answer that question. First of all, I would make a distinction between our attachment to non-alignment and then what we are doing now. Very few people noted that in the UN General Assembly resolution, we were actually going against the public mood in that World Court. We were in a very small minority of countries which abstained. Many of our southern partners, least developed countries, they just voted wholesale in favor of the resolution, asking Russia to unconditionally withdraw from territories they had occupied. In that sense, we were completely out of sync with the global south. I think this needs to be noted. What we are now doing, in my humble view, is making amends by telling the global south that we may have had reasons to abstain, but we are suffering the same consequences as you from the war in Ukraine. We will now try to be with you to try and alleviate the negative consequences of the war in Ukraine. So I do believe there is a diplomatic angle to this global south, frankly. That is the way I see it. But I certainly don't think we are going back to non-alignment and things like that. Increasingly in the climate change negotiations and the WTO negotiations, I want your students or the audience to know that we are no longer with China. India, China needs to be together in the basic coalition in climate change and in the WTO. In both fora, my understanding is India is back to either fighting it out or in conjunction with Africa. In fact, in WTO, it is the India-Africa alliance which is turning out to be extremely important. And the climate change, we also need to handle the small island states and other least developed countries which have their own acts to, which have their own, shall we say, beef with India. I think all in all, this is a good move by India to tell the global South that, listen, we are suffering from the war as well, even though we abstained. It is not as if we are condoning the actions of Russia. We are not condemning the perpetrator, but we are not condoning the actions in which we are suffering from. Thank you.
Okay, and before I take questions from Ankit Bhuptani and Noble Robinson next, I just wanted to take a question to Ambassador Chhabra. Swarnendu asks, what are we expecting as the outcome of G20 summit to be like? Will there be any change in geopolitics in our favor?
We are expecting a sort of forward movement in the areas that I mentioned. So I think a shift in geopolitics, I mean, it doesn't happen like this over a few weeks or months leading up to the G20 summit. So, but of course, we will put our imprint on the final document, as Ambassador Mohan Kumar mentioned. I mean, there's already talk about how the paragraphs will be worded and how it will be sort of framed and the nuances in that. So there won't be any shift discernible in that sense, where you can clearly pin out, but there will be areas where they'll be moving in that direction. So that's what will happen.
And a quick question, Suhasini, if you could come in on this. Abhuday Saraswat asks, because, the Hindu has been at the forefront of reporting a lot of, in fact, developments in the LSE, which a lot of the other media people have been silent about. Abhuday wants to ask, China's attempt at shifting the status quo of LSE with the recent skirmishes, are they similar to the Russian attempt of gaining Donbass?
Well, certainly, and I think it's officially acknowledged that what China is doing is what is called salami slicing, that it keeps trying to what the government calls alter the status quo at the line of actual control, although the government has consistently denied that China has occupied any Indian territory and not updated Prime Minister Modi's statement of June 2020 that no one is inside Indian territory, nor has anyone taken any posts inside Indian territory. I think the truth is that what we are seeing is a continued aggression from China. That despite these 3 years of talks, that we still see an event like we did in Tawang last month, where Chinese PLA soldiers attempted to take over an Indian post unsuccessfully, but the attempt was certainly made. However, I do think that in this year of G20 and SCO, as I pointed out, there remains the hope that the standoff with China will essentially, will not go back to, say, Galwan levels, but that they will be able to keep up the dialogue going. So, for example, despite everything we have seen at the border, we have seen dozens of rounds of military commander level talks. We've also seen talks at the level of the WMCC, the working mechanism, which involves diplomats as well as Home Ministry and military officials. Those are continuing. The fact is that India has not attempted aggressive action, except for, I think, in August 2020, when soldiers took over some of the heights on the Pangong Lake South area, which subsequently India vacated during the talks. But apart from that, we have not seen a counter-aggressive action in quite the same way. And the fact that Prime Minister Modi, for whatever it was worth, we saw him on TV during the last G20 in Bali, during the dinner engagement, turn around and shake hands with Chinese President Xi Jinping. I think what that was conveyed was that it is still possible to talk. So we're going to see more of that in the next few months. As I said, India will hope that China will attend both the SCO summit and the G20. Again, like President Putin, I'm not sure that President Xi Jinping will come for both. Although he attended both the SCO and the G20 last year, those were in different
But they
places.
were in different countries, yeah.
And in Indonesia. So maybe it will be him for one and his premier for the other. But it does remain to be seen how India is going to tackle this, given that these tensions remain. However, talks are continuing, and while talks continue, it should be possible to include China in its negotiations. Remember, on other issues, India and China have been at the multilateral stage, having some coordination, although I agree with Ambassador Mohan Kumar that India and China are no longer part of the same group. But where it is necessary, they do have similar positions.
Yeah, and I think the trade, of course, part is still the trajectory is upwards. Of course, that deficit for India still continues. Let me go over to Ankit Bhuptani. You can please tell who do you want to ask the question to and keep it short.
Good evening. Yeah, I'm not sure to whom. Maybe the moderator can take the call after hearing the question.
Sure.
So last year, during the COP27, I was speaking to a diplomat friend from Africa, and she was telling me that when Global South is asked to go green and without getting the finance to do so, we are forced to go towards Beijing. When Global South is asked to go digital, again without equipped financial support and technological support, we need to go Beijing. So when during the COP26, there was this commitment made, which has yet not been delivered. Now that we are having the presidency of G20, after having the Global South Summit, do you think that India can also play a role of questioning, I don't know the diplomatic word, questioning maybe too strong, but make the voice heard of Global South in this concern about the big country's commitment, financial commitments are not delivering? And if I can just add on to a small one, and that is
very briefly, Ankit, please.
We are also hosting few events in Jammu and Kashmir during the G20. Do you think that it will have some impact on the global position on J&K or not? Thank you so much.
Okay. I think some of it is already answered, though, when also Ambassador Kumar suggested about that sort of audit. Noble, please go ahead and ask the question. Noble Robinson.
Great. Hello. Am I audible now?
Yes.
My question is to His Excellency Ambassador Mohan Kumar. In regards to the Global South, we sort of say that on one hand, we sort of stay with the Global South. And then we say that, you know what, whatever we did for abstention for the UNGA resolution was because we had to do it. In regards to that, do you think, sir, will the Global South actually buy us? Because on one hand, we're getting the cheap oils from them, and then India is hugely benefiting from it. And then on the other hand, we're saying, you know what, we are with you. So we are kind of being a hypocritical Western democracy here. So what will the Global South's reaction be? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ambassador Kumar?
Oh, I think, Noble, you have a point, but not too much of a point. And by the way, I may slightly differ with others when they say we are buying huge quantities of oil. I mean, look at the diesel purchases from Russia by Europe. They completely dwarf the purchases of oil from India. Yes, we are buying much more than what we bought earlier, but Russia knows this, we know this is purely temporary, and we are making hay while sun shines, I agree. I do not share, Noble, your perspective that the Global South accuses India of hypocrisy. You're not crediting the Global South with enough, shall we say, awareness or appreciation. They know the helplessness of India. India is actually helpless. This is the way I describe India's dependence on Russia's weapon platforms. We are actually helpless. We can argue that we did this at a time when nobody else was helping us. The fact of the matter is we got addicted to it, and like good opium and cheap opium, we just got more and more addicted to it. So I think the Global South knows this. One way in which to the extent you have a point, Noble, one way in which India can do something is what it is already doing, but we can do it much more. The Aadhaar card technology, for example, that we are making available to some countries, like I remember Morocco asking for it and other countries, we can make this available. And this is something we offered in the Paris Peace Forum, we can do that. UPI platform, we can do. I think the Global South also knows that going to Beijing has unacceptable risks. Look at Zambia, look at Tanzania, look at Sri Lanka. You don't need to look further. So yes, you will be forced to go for finance to Beijing, but there are very, very high risks involved in it. India, I'm afraid, cannot come up with the kind of funds that the BRI does. I'll be honest with you, we can't. But what we
can't match a dollar to dollar. I mean, it's beyond the question for us. So what we can
do is share technology of this kind, which I think will be very useful for these countries.
Ambassador Chhabra, I think the two questions were kind of related. And also, you know, how really do you go about building a green agenda consensus? There are deep divisions within the G20 we've already talked about. How do you really go about building this consensus and reflecting the global South concerns within the G20 framework?
Yeah, I mean, basically sort of by persuasively making our point, which I think people are appreciating, as I said, more every time. And as Ambassador Mohan Kumar mentioned, reminding them about their commitment for funding. But if that fund doesn't come, I mean, going to China is sort of, there is a certain element of a choice there. So as mentioned earlier, I mean, if you go there, there are those risks. Otherwise, I mean, there are some technologies available with India, elsewhere where you could take it, but that's true. But these offers from China are so attractively packaged, you don't realize, sort of, if you don't read the fine print, you could easily get sucked into that. So that, I think now, as Mr. Mohan Kumar mentioned, people have got aware of so many of these examples happening. So everyone is a little cautious before stepping onto that direction. And they know what risks they are taking when they go that way.
Absolutely. I'm just going to take two questions from the chat box and take a final question from Sankhadri, who has had his hand raised for a while. From the chat box, Satyam Tripathi wants to know, there has been a general rise in non-declared wars in the world. The UN has met with a failure in tackling them. How does G20 as an opportunity present, basically for India, an opportunity to harness the structural multilateral reforms? So Hasini, would you like to come in on that?
Well, I think it is necessary to look at the fact. I'm just trying to find the question since it was a slightly long.
Yeah, it's basically about G20 providing an opportunity for structural multilateral reforms.
Well, I frankly think the structured multilateral reform that India is most interested in is the UN Security Council at present, and that's a completely different move. However, in holding the G20 and in finding a way forward, in making the G20 a viable, sustainable, and effective body, and I think what we saw in Indonesia will be carried forward in India, will probably be carried forward with Brazil and South Africa as well. You will see the passing of the baton of the G20 that was once seen as a body really run by the G7 and a few others, into a body that will be led by the voices of the developing world. So in building this kind of a narrative to the G20 and in ensuring that the richest countries of the world are party to it, as they were in Bali and as they will be in India. I think in any case, the global discourse is shifting in terms of saying that we have to be more democratic, we have to be more representative. The UN Security Council is completely unrepresentative at present, and it's unbelievable how long it is sustained. But much longer can it go without a single member from Africa or a single permanent member from South America, only one member from Asia, and India being the most populous country in the world, not represented there on a permanent basis. You're already seeing that discourse change globally, and I think the Ukraine conflict has, in a sense, taken the discussions up a notch. So I think the holding of the G20 as a viable alternative platform for building a global narrative on important issues. Because remember, in the past, it used to be G20s only about economic issues. Today, even if the officials might say it, we can see from that Bali document that it is not a place where only economic issues are being discussed, and economic issues now bleed into everything else. So it is possible to see the G20 not just as it was originally planned, as a kind of in-between between the G7 or G8 as they were in the 1990s and the OECD, which was unwieldy, more than 40 countries, instead becoming a kind of a vehicle for the with the maximum kind of space to work on a global narrative.
Ambassador Mohan Kumar, would you like to take that thought a little forward? And maybe Abdul Muqtadir also has a question, if I'm reading it right. Basically, India is in a South Asian zone where we are seeing so much of economic instability currently in our neighborhood itself, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. Do you see the effects of these instability in the countries also becoming a talking point, something that is, very much there in the room during the G20 meetings?
Yes. So to take off from where Ms. Suhasini Haidar left, which is on this issue of multilateralism question that you posed, it's interesting for me, just as a diplomatic observer, that what the UN Security Council could not manage in terms of a paragraph consensus document, the G20 has managed in Bali. That's quite amazing. It doesn't matter that it says most countries and so on. But the fact is, there was a paragraph consensus document which emerged from Bali on Ukraine, a feat that has not been managed by the present dysfunctional, incompetent UN Security Council. The UN General Assembly managed it through a vote. I commend the UN General Assembly for it. But because the veto system intervenes in the Security Council has not been able to come up with anything. So I would add that. On the other issue of what the poorer countries, the instability in South Asia, there are two tracks in the G20, as your students know. One is the Sherpa track. I think most of the discussions we have had is Sherpa track. I would give some importance to the finance track as well. It is the finance track which will come up with funds. And one of the important things it has to do is the paragraph on debt, which is why I mentioned it right in the beginning. A paragraph 33, the famous paragraph 33 of the Bali Declaration, students should take a look at it, where China dissociated itself from the debt service suspension initiative and a common framework for debt. I honestly believe India must push very hard using the voice of the Global South Summit to come up with a common framework for debt, and then again put China under pressure. And if China wants to dissociate itself, so be it, but at least the Global South will know which country is dissociating itself from it. I think that is the only thing India can do to help the countries of the Global South.
Okay, I'm just going to take the absolute last two questions. Shankadi Bhattacharya, you've had your hand raised for a while. Please go ahead. And then Avni Sablok will be the final question. Yes, Shankadi, please ask your question and keep it brief. Sankadeep. Okay, we seem to have a problem there. Avni, would you like to ask your question quickly?
Thank you, ma'am. My question is, given that Sir just mentioned that G20 is able to reach consensus, which the UNO as another multilateral forum is not able to. Do you think that in the near future, G20, if it goes on to this path and the Global South countries, the presidency keeps on passing from one developing country to another, do you think that they will be able to, G20 will be able to replace United Nations as a multilateral forum reaching consensus? And the second question is, do you think that G20 as a platform is better suited to solve the crisis, the Afghan crisis, where women and girls are denied their rights continuously?
So very quickly,
if
you allow me, the answer to the first question is no, because go through the Bali Leaders Declaration, it very clearly says the G20 is not the relevant forum to solve security issues. So matters of war and peace will still go to the dysfunctional UN Security Council. I made it as a rhetorical point saying that the UN Security Council is so incompetent that it is not even capable of coming out with a paragraph. As far as the second point is concerned, Avni, what was your second point? I'm sorry.
On Afghanistan.
On Afghanistan.
The issue of women in Afghanistan.
Yes, I think the answer to your second question is yes. And India, in fact, has repeatedly mentioned women and gender as a priority in their G20 presidency. I have not heard exactly what we have in mind, but it is certainly a priority area. And I believe Afghanistan certainly should interest all of us in the G20. Thank you.
Okay, your concluding thoughts on this, Ambassador Chawla?
I think Ambassador Mohan Kumar has well summed up the sort of situation, the way we are headed. So I just don't see, of course, the G20 sort of taking over the role of the UN Security Council. We'll just have to wait and see how things evolve. But in the meantime, also, as Avni sort of mentioned, I think she was assuming that it'll keep passing the baton from south to south. I mean, I think it's a rotation, and very soon it'll go on back to the G7 and the other countries of the West. So it's another year or two that will be with the South countries, during which we could sort of direct the debate in the direction that we wanted to. After which, if you have built up enough momentum, these issues are sort of up there and they need to be sort of looked at from the viewpoint of the Global South.
Okay, so Hasini, Ankit Bhuptani had asked a question on the impact of some of these G20 events being held in Jammu Kashmir and it's then the projection on the international map. Farooq Ahmed Waza also wants to know if this will make a difference on the Kashmir issue.
I certainly think we need to remember that as the host of the G20, India's real primary job is going to be to build consensus and not to be looking to score political points. As a result of that, plus, as I keep mentioning, the need to have the SCO summit, which will also bring the Chinese president or Chinese leader, will also bring the Pakistani leader. Before that, the SCO foreign minister has already invited the Pakistani foreign minister to India. These are going to only happen in an atmosphere where India is being a good host in terms of bringing a consensus together. So to that end, I think the meetings will be held in Jammu Kashmir because the government has made it clear they intend to hold meetings in 50 venues. There's more than 200 meetings that they are planning, and those 50 venues will be in each state and union territory, so Arunachal Pradesh as well. We expect to see a meeting, but I am not sure that those meetings would be the ones that are seen at a ministerial level or at a visiting delegation level. Because as I said, the important thing with the G20, with being the host of anything, of any such multilateral summit, the emphasis will be on building consensus, not on scoring points.
Okay, that's an important point. Sankadweep, I'll give you one more chance. Let me see if you can ask your question. Sankadweep, are you there? Okay, I'm sorry, I tried. Yes, quickly ask your question. I'm sorry, we can't take in the question now, but just as I end, in fact, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, Vidya had a question. It is very unclear that what are the end expectations Putin has from this war, where Putin would like to stop regarding this war. Would you like to just share some last thoughts?
Thank you, Smita. I was just typing the answer for her, actually. Anyway, very briefly, the basic minimum that Putin will not negotiate is Crimea. He's got the Black Sea Fleet there, and I think it should be well known to people that Crimea is not the same as his invasion of Ukraine now. I'm going to call the thing an invasion because that's what it is. We call that annexation. Diplomats play with words, but I think Crimea is fundamentally different. That is non-negotiable. As far as Donbass is concerned, he would like to keep as much as possible. And his whole point is Minsk Accords completely failed. So if we are looking at an eventual solution, purely from Putin's perspective, the only thing that will satisfy him is non-NATO membership for Ukraine and some kind of neutrality. And whether he can negotiate over Donbass will come after he has been assured of goodwill from NATO. So we are a long way off from that. So to answer the question, the basic minimum is Crimea. That is simply non-negotiable from Putin's perspective.
Okay, I think we're going to leave it there. There were a lot of questions that came in. I'm, grateful to the attendees who came in here and the people who joined in the other platform. We tried tackling a lot of broad issues, but going forward, we will continue to have these conversations. And I think Suhasini made an important point that if we are talking about Vasudev Kutumbakam, the world being one family, India also believes in Atithi Devo Bhava. So, whatever India does as a host, we'll have to ensure that it's more towards consensus building and rapprochements really on crucial issues that concern the world today. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining in. Let's Talk Policy. You can, of course, tune in to all the social media handles and watch this video again if you missed this webinar. And a happy Republic Day to all of those as well, or to all Indian citizens watching this Let's Talk Policy broadcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.